I was in Milwaukee at that time and searching for what's going on in the world. And so my mother would pass down her old House Beautiful, Vogue's, House and Garden, Deck magazines. And I read them with interest because it told somewhat what was going on in other parts of the country and world. And I was just bowled away. And I think Michael James will have the same feeling about seeing quilts in magazines, because as early as the late 60s, 1968, for example, Vogue had this fantastic spread of Gloria Vanderbilt, AKA Anderson Cooper's mother, in a patchwork room that she had created, ceiling, floors, walls. It was just spectacular. And then I began seeing quilts made by Mountain Artisans, which was a quilting co-op at that time, where artists would design quilts to be made, and they would be made and make money for the women who were working in this cooperative. Often they were in the South or they were in Appalachia. So they were fantastic quilts, and that piqued my interest in quilts. And then you began seeing all around the country antique quilt shows, including the book for Jonathan Holstein's Abstract Design in American Pieced Quilts. And I remember, as I was like 22 then, going with friends who weren't even that interested in quilts. And they would sit with me and page and page and page through. And we would talk about what we loved about it and how it worked together. And look at that yellow block in the corner that just makes it kind of sing. And I found that's what I really liked to do. Now, I did make quilts, but my main interest, I only made maybe 6 or 7. My main interest was not in seeing what I could do, but seeing what other people could do. And I think that's the art historian versus artist in me. And so I got together with a history professor at the university, and he helped me get a National Endowment for the Arts grant to have a show that I could assemble. And I thought, well, I can't do a countrywide show because it's just me, but I wanted to do a show of Ohio quilts so I could see what was going on. And my prereqs were that the quilts had to have been made over the last 5 years because I wanted new quilts. So the quilts that we got for that show, which did travel around Ohio, interestingly, it traveled around Ohio for one day. My daughter, who was it was in 1976 and she was 10, she would help me, my older daughter, she would help me go to these locations like the Columbus Convention Center, put up the quilts, and then take them down at night. So we had this traveling show, and people would say, oh, I wish the quilts were going to be here longer. And why are they only up for a day? And it was just me. And it was a wonderful show because that's when I saw Nancy Crow, Francoise Barnes, the late Wenda Van Wise. And because I was sitting in the gallery, I was just studying these new quilts all day long. And it hit me that that is what I wanted to do, is I wanted to show other people these wonderful quilts and have them appreciated.
Coming off the graduate experience, I did have serious motivation for making a living. And that got me really into getting serious about quilts. I had been dabbling in quilt making and its history while I was getting my graduate degree. It was a way to kind of get some relief from the pressures of the graduate program, which were intense. And in my second year, I had to have a thesis show. So that was a fairly stressful period. And I found that my interest in quilts gave me some release from that stress. The other factor in that was that my wife, Judy, was a sewer and had been since she was a child. And she sewed all her clothes and a lot of my clothes and our son's clothes. And I was, part of our kind of agreement in getting together was that both of us being enthusiastic feminists, we would share everything and we would split everything. So all the household duties were 50-50. The child rearing was 50-50. And in sort of line with this, building an interest in fabric and sewing was a way to kind of endear myself even more to her. And so, and she has certainly encouraged that. But fairly quickly, I found out that the level of creative expression that was possible with fabric in the form of patchwork and quilts was significant and was very satisfying. And so to end this bit, I'll just say that within 3 months of getting my graduate degree in 1973, I stopped painting and turned, exclusively to fabric.
So talk more about that. What about that idea that it was so much more satisfying and you liked that the creativity it allowed you?
Well, it was just another medium. I saw it as another medium. And I wanted to know more about it. And I was, I knew a lot about art history broadly. So that's always been a passion. But this was a lot of new stuff that I didn't know. And it tied with my interest in history, especially early American history, colonial history. And, living in New England, you're surrounded by the architecture of the 17th and 18th centuries, the 19th, certainly. And I was very interested in early New England architecture and furniture and everything that had to do with that period. And so this was a way to sort of increase my knowledge of that whole era.
You're in this period, you're beginning to show work. What do you feel is like your big break? That what broke it open for you, or was it just a constant?
I have some very dear Swiss friends that I met early on because of quilts. And we often went hiking with them in Switzerland when I was there to teach. And I also, through the 80s and 90s, had a gallery in the French part of Switzerland that I showed at regularly, many shows there. And we'd go hiking with these friends, and the husband always insisted that we keep in mind one step in front of the other, one step at a time. Just think about the next step. Don't think about how high that looks or how far away it looks. Just think about the next step. And that's really what it was. It was piecing together. It was like making a quilt. It was piecing together a career by doing anything that seemed, reasonable and possibly profitable, and that allowed me to feel like I could do all this with a sense of integrity, and that it was worth doing. So, you know, one, you know, as far as any single thing, certainly I had those 2 early visual artists fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, and those were major in terms really of building my confidence and giving me a sense that yes, this was something, you know, worth doing, and it was going to be recognized, and so on. I was going somewhere else with that thought. And I had actually later a 3rd NEA fellowship. I received a NEA US-France exchange fellowship, and that underwrote 3 months living in the south of France with a group of about 20 artists, one of whom happened to be Faith Ringgold. So we got to know each other.
Wow.
At this residency called La Napoule, at a place called the Chateau de La Napoule, which is about 5 miles west of Cannes and 20 or so miles west of Nice on the Mediterranean. It was an idyllic situation. And it was a perfect experience for me at the right time, because it was like going back to grad school, this time with a much bigger appreciation for the potential in the time that I was offered there. And I used it to really advance my work. Although I didn't do a thing in fabric for 3 months, I didn't even have a sewing machine with me.
Really?
I only worked on paper, mostly with oil stick and pastels and so on. But it gave me a way to figure out where I wanted to take my fabric work next. And so that was a real pivotal moment, probably as pivotal as any other moment, I would say, in my career. Maybe with the exception, or maybe alongside, let's say, the next big pivotal moment was leaving the private sector and joining the faculty here at the university in 2000. But yeah, those were major points. The Jameses had a lot of name recognition in the quilt world as early as the mid 80s. Certainly other artists learned that there was this couple out there who were very enthusiastic about the work and were interested in collecting it. Artists signed up for a workshop that I was giving at the Brookfield Craft Center in, I think it was either 1979 or 80. It could have been 81. It was right around, my first book had been published. And I think that was part of her interest, was piqued partly by that book. So she and a close friend of hers named Wilma Lane, who lived not far from the Brookfield Craft Center. Brookfield Craft Center is in Western Connecticut. So it wasn't far from where artists lived in Chappaqua, New York. But Wilma lived closer because she was in Connecticut. And they came together and they took several workshops. It wasn't just one. So we got to know each other that way. And, you know, artists, she was a sweetheart, always. She was just the sweetest person. She always had great questions. She was perceptive. She was genuine, and her responses were always sincere, whether it was surprise or pleasure or uh, skepticism sometimes, and she was just lovely. So so that's how she and I met, and it would be a number of years before I met Bob, but early in the 80s, he contacted me one December and phoned me and explained who he was, and said that he wanted to buy his wife a quilt of mine for Christmas. So I said, I'll send you some slides, which I did. And a week later, he called back and he said, well, I got your slides. I've been looking at them. He said, the problem is I just don't know which one. I like them all. I'm just not sure which one to. He said, I've been looking and looking. And he said, so I think the only thing I can do is buy all of them. There were 6 quilts that I had sent him slides of.
Yeah. So what were your first quilts like? What were you doing, kind of typical patchwork, or did you already have a unique style?
Really quite keen on the piecing side of patchwork and designing around the piecing, that the hard edge geometry of piecing. That was really what I was keen on. Having that sort of ordered, straight edged geometric pattern. That was what and so slightly later, when I had a commission to design, say, an Art Nouveau quilt, which I think you've got in your collection now.
We do.
Okay, with Art Nouveau, those lovely flowing lines, I was still stuck on the piecing. So I made the flowing lines out of hard-edged piecing.
It is interesting how you have those combined in that quilt. I love the way that you created the leaves and the flowers with that very hard edge.
Yeah.
So you still do see a real link between your pieces and that kind of development of that piecing work.
Yeah. So. Yeah. So there was a friend down the road, this was about 1977, who saw the little bits of patchwork that I was making. And then he said, I'd like to commission you a piece of work based on Egyptian art. This is about 1977. And it was a great commission, because it was like wonderful to have that sort of someone recognizing that you're taking this seriously. And also, because I lived in London, I took myself off to the British Museum and studied the colour, particularly on the Egyptian artifacts in there, and made this piece of work for my friend Angelo Cinque, who commissioned me this piece of work. So that was number 1 commission. At that time, then I made that, and then I thought, right, I'd like to have a one-person show. And this is something that comes up in my life a lot. I have this request, I'd like to have a one-person show. And I went along to Foyle's bookshop with this Egyptian quilt, actually, and then said to them, the bookshop had a gallery in it, in the middle of it. And I said, I'd like to have a one-person show, and this is some of the work that I've made. And could I have the show in 2 years' time, please? And they said yes.
Wow.
So that was really great. And about that sort of time, 1978, 79 was when I had the show in Foyles. And so that was my first one-person show. And in 1978, 79, I also applied to the Crafts Council in London. So there's a body of people that was a real big thing to be recognised by them. So they gave me a setting up grant, which was fantastic. But it wasn't just the money. I mean, you got in those days, it was a couple of £1,000, so it was a lot of money for me then. But it was the fact that it came from them that was so important, you know, that they recognised that I was a maker, an up-and-coming maker. So that meant a lot to me.
How is it that you had that ability to trust yourself to take on a one-woman show when you were really at the very, very beginning of your career?
Oh, it's something like the word determination comes in. I just made one quilt, and I kind of felt determined that this was going to be my vocation or my career right from the beginning. I think, you know, there's always a lot of rejection along the way for artists. I try and think of it a bit like, you know, in the architectural world, architects forever putting out ideas and then forever getting rejections back as well. And I just try and think of it like that. But when I did get the rejections, I tended to make me more determined, which was great. That was the best way around. It made me angry, but I would be more determined.
I love that.
Well, there was maybe a group of us at that point where we would try and interest mainstream galleries, but it was always a struggle. And they just didn't sort of know how to look at quilts, I think.
When you had such a specific style, when I look at our early quilts, and we have quilts from you that probably 1980, 1983, 1986, and it was very much that geometric period. So can you talk a little bit more about kind of just what your goals were, what you were trying to achieve in those very hard-edged geometric quilts?
You know, very much working with dark, medium and light tones, and yeah, really just working a lot with graph paper designs and planning out my quilts. I mean, in those days, I used to really just do a drawing of what quilt I was going to make large scale and blow it up large scale and make it in fabric. I mean, I'd never worked like that now. It makes me smile really thinking of it. But I made a point of trying to send something to be considered to the Quilt National, and was lucky enough to get pieces in there. And this is where Penny comes in, because Penny McMorris saw my work at the Quilt National and liked it. And then she was coming on a trip to the UK and came to visit me in the early 80s. And so that was, and it was through Penny, and there's another person who's been totally wonderful to me and supporting what I do, you know. And she introduced me to Robert and Ardis, or suggested that I think Ardis was coming to the UK. That's sort of like not going forward now to about 1984. And I think Penny said, go and see Pauline. And so that's how that relationship began, really.
How did that impact your work and your career when you have someone like Penny or the Jameses come and purchase your work? What impact did that have on you as a person?
It just made me more determined to continue to try and make a living from my work. I mean, I knew that it would always be a bit of a slow process to try and earn a living from your work. But to have that sort of rubber stamp of approval from them felt very warming indeed, you know. So it just gave me a lot more confidence, really. And of course, it was fantastic to actually sell large pieces, you know. It also made me think, I mean, they did very nicely just by the work that I'd made, you know. And it made me think a lot about commissioned work. And I'd done quite a lot of commissioned work. And I wasn't sure if I really wanted to work on commissions. And I would much rather go my own way, make the work and hope to sell it, which is, I guess that was started from them just buying the work, you know. You know, because I thought you can do this, you know, you can try and sell the work, and yeah, so it was completely reassuring for, you know, that goal of trying to earn my living from my work.
So tell me more about that first visit. What was that like to meet Bob and Artis the first time?
I don't know that I met Bob then. I don't remember. I may very well have, but I do remember Artis, and she was so open and friendly and laughing, and she didn't, you know, you'd think some people could be, if they wanted to work with someone, would be very structured and have lists of notes, but no, we just talked, and I told them my idea was not to come up with a framework of we need one of these and one of these and one of these, and we'll come up with a budget. We didn't do any of that. I just told them that I would look and try to find them the best quilts that were out there, and that was my job, and I would not seek discounts for the quilts because I felt they could decide whether they thought the quilt was worth the price being asked, but I was not going to ask the artist for a discount, and I didn't think we should set up real framework. I thought we should just see what was out there and try to get the best. And they agreed to that. And so we started by correspondence, back and forth and back and forth. And then every once in a while, when I was going to be in New York, I would let them know, and I would take the train to Chappaqua, and Artis and I especially would meet. Now, when there was Quilt National, Bob, of course, was there with Artis, and we would hang together and discuss the quilts and walk around, and then he would decide and she would decide whether they wanted to buy any of them.
I'll never forget when we opened the building in 2008, we showed Nancy Crow work, and most of the work that we showed was Nancy's new work. It was not ours, it was on loan, but we took out her early log cabin quilt, Crosses, or it's a variation on the log cabins. And I feel like that was just a pivotal moment for me, because I looked at that quilt and I thought, now that is a timeless quilt. So if I were to say that to you, this is a timeless quilt, what does that mean to you? Because I feel like you had to have seen something in these quilts.
It's fascinating because that was one of the quilts that was in Ohio Patchwork 76 that I put together in 1976. And that was of all the other quilts there, that was the quilt that made me stop making quilts, because I realized that my joy was not in cutting and sewing and then finally looking at my quilts and you know, that I didn't have that in me. but I did have it in me to appreciate that. And so that to me is was a monumental quilt in my career of pointing out wonderful quilts. I love that quilt. And it still looks fresh and fabulous and almost undateable.
Exactly. And what do you think what is that quality that makes an artwork that is fresh anytime you see it?
I don't know.
I thought you might have an answer because you know it when you see it, but it's hard to define it.
I was surprised when I was at a quilt show seeing some quilts that I had suggested. This might have been Jack Walsh's collection, and there was an exhibition of his quilts, and I hadn't seen the quilts for quite some time, and I started crying seeing them again. So I'm kind of an easy crier too.
Nothing wrong with that. So am I. No, I think honestly, I think that isn't that what art should do is provoke that emotion.
What you've described is something that just hits you and makes you, and you don't, some people might be able to explain it, I can't, but it really does hit you.
As you and artists are talking, and I've read a lot of the letters between the two of you, obviously you had a terrific friendship. What was that conversation like between the two of you when you would stand in front of a quilt? What did artists see, or what was she responding to?
We were mainly looking at slides, and I don't really remember. Keep in mind, it's been many years now since I've seen artists, and I don't really remember. I do remember her being very open. She was the one who, of the pair, who was very interested in the artists themselves as people. And she was very intuitive about things and she was just very open. So sometimes I would push her a little bit. There might be a piece that she wasn't quite sure about or he wasn't quite sure about. And I would kind of push, and they would always respond. I can't think of a piece that I really loved that they said, no, I don't see it. I don't want it. They were just very, very receptive. So, and I remember her just being very caring about the quilts. And I don't think when she started, she realized how much it was going to take over her life, how much work it was for her, because I would just suggest, and then I would call the artist and say that they would like to buy it, and the artist would ship it. Well, then I'm home. I'm not unpacking. I'm not unfolding, getting rid of the boxes, finding a safe place where the quilt could be lying flat, inviting people over to see it. I mean, one of the letters she said to me is, it takes 105% of her time. And I believe it. She worked very, very hard. And she was just a wonderful, wonderful woman with always smiling, always laughing. I cannot remember her saying a bad word about anyone ever, or putting anyone down. She was just a really wonderful, warm woman.
She was really special.
A huge sense of humor, and she was a very good writer. I was amazed to refresh my memory. I think I have a note. The show that ran in Japan about 1995. I'm looking at my notes. roughly 1990. It had 41 antique quilts, and at her insistence, at their insistence, 10 contemporary. They didn't ask for the contemporary quilts. They wanted a show in Japan of antique quilts. Well, they insisted there be contemporary quilts included. And artists wrote all 41 of the descriptions for the antique quilts. So she was really a very good writer on top of everything else.
She was. And just, I find it so interesting, you know, a Nebraska girl, came from Nebraska with a lot of experience, but she just must have had just an excellent eye. You see it in the quilts over and over and over again. But did that strike you when you would talk or make decisions?
Well, she was very receptive to whatever I was suggesting. So I don't remember specifics about our individual conversations, but I do remember she was very open to new things, new ideas. I mean, for example, they bought Gail Frost and Duncan Slade's Precipice, which is not a quilt per se. It's a wooden panel, huge, with 3 panels of quilt within the wooden frame. And they didn't balk at that. So they were moving out in other directions, not specifically quilts that we can hang on the wall.
I love when she writes about how it was so great to get Precipice until they had to get it up the stairs.
Right.
Those were narrow stairs.
We were chuckling about the idea of when it would arrive, how we would get it up the stairs. And when it did arrive and we managed to get it up the stairs, we weren't so chuckly. Well, also, she invited, they were both all about showing the quilts to other people, not for an ego trip. It wasn't about them and their collection. It was about, look what we have that you could enjoy, that you might want to start collecting, that you could learn from. It was all about offering other people an opportunity to learn about contemporary quilts, about antique quilts, and that they were willing to do the work. And you think, before they built their gallery above the garage, they would always invite people in to see the quilts, groups that were traveling in the area. And she had to show the quilts. They were on every bed in the house except the ones that they used. And they were stuck away in linen closets. I read something about Bob complaining that he couldn't find towels anymore because of the linen closets. And that's why one reason they chose to build a gallery for the quilts. But also, when they received requests to loan a quilt, it would be a specific quilt. And artists would have to find that quilt, which might very well be at the bottom of a pile. Now you remember, and I remember, artist was not a large woman. And for her, she would have to have someone in that could help her lift the quilts, and she'd have to find it. And it was just very taxing on her, just unearthing quilts from piles. And they were on piles so they wouldn't get fold lines. And so when they built the gallery, it was much, much easier. They could display corners and she knew what was on what pile.
So when you look back now, and this has just been an amazing thing with the development of the collection here at the university. What do you feel was the James's impact on quilting and quilt history?
Oh, I think it was phenomenal. They were the first collectors, particularly of contemporary quilts. And so they would do their best to get the word out on that, sending magazine articles, talking to journalists to get their idea of contemporary quilts are something that people can collect these days. Look what is being done. And they also shared all of their sources with people. Some collector might want to keep the source to themselves, but they were actively encouraging other people. The whole idea of the International Quilt Study Center Museum was to let people learn about quilts, just let them see them so that they would be well taken care of, the quilts, and people would find a place where they could see quilts from all over the world and at all different time periods and learn from them. So I think that was the just immense contribution that they made.